So greeting viewers, it's great to have you join us today. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi warmly welcomes you to the continuation of the African Book Talk series. We had taken a short break from the series, but now we are back with an exciting lineup of authors. We hope you will be a regular guest to our book talk going forward. Before we get the show going, I would like to highlight that this program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, which is Columbia Global Centers Nairobi. You're welcome to review the book series playlist at your pleasure. As we proceed, please post your questions under the Q&A section. The moderator will direct them to the author at the end of the session. Follow us on social media. That way you will not miss any of our upcoming programs. I would now like to hand over to my colleague Lillian to open the session. Welcome, Lillian.
Thank you, Pauline, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. My name is Lillian Olik. I'm the Grants and Communication Specialist at CGC Nairobi. Columbia Global Center Nairobi is part of Columbia University Global Networks, which together aim to create opportunities in research, scholarship, and teaching around the world. Our centers serve as a regional hub for research and collaboration as part of the university's strategy to achieve a global presence and link the continent to the scientific rigor, technological innovation, and academic leadership that happens there. It's also a member of a Columbia Global Center Network, which is intended to serve as a research hub for Columbia-related international programs and initiatives. There are currently 8 Columbia Global Centers operating in 9 areas, that is Amman, Beijing, Mumbai, Paris, Istanbul, Santiago, and Rio. Our programs have 3 core components: business empowerment, creative and liberal arts, education and knowledge, health initiatives, and refugee and migration. As part of the creative and liberal arts program, the virtual book talk series features African authors. With this series, we hope to offer a platform where African writers can engage a global audience, offering not just their work, but exciting perspectives on how personal, political, and cultural experiences drive their storytelling. And today, we are going to feature The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohamed. The book features Mahmood Mattan, a fixture in Cardiff's Tiger Bay in 1952, which bustles with Somali and West Indian sailors. And now I will introduce our moderator, Hassan Gedi Santur, who is a journalist, editor, and a novelist. His journalism work has appeared in the New York Times, Yahoo News, and CBC Radio, among others. He's the author of novels, Something Remains, and The Youth of God, and a nonfiction book, Maps of Exile. The Youth of God was a finalist for the Pius Adesanmi Memorial Award for Excellence in African Writing in 2019, and also nominated for Canada Reads 2020. He's currently working on his 3rd novel, Imagined Lives. And now I would like to welcome Hassan Gedi, our moderator, to lead us to the next session. Welcome, Hassan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for the kind introduction, and my special thanks to the Columbia Global Center Nairobi. The work that you have done and continue to do on behalf of the Columbia University alumni community is wonderful and much appreciated. And I am really honored and delighted to introduce our guest today. Nadifa Mohamed burst into the literary scene in 2010 with the publication of her debut novel, The Black Mamba Boy, or Black Mamba Boy rather. She followed the success of that novel with The Orchard of Lost Souls in 2014. Her fiction has been published in over 15 languages and has garnered her numerous literary prizes, including the Guardian First Book Award and the Penn Open Book Award, among many others. Nadifa Mohamed, welcome to the Columbia Global Center's African Book Talk series. And
Thank you for having me, Hassan.
yeah. And first of all, I just want to congratulate you on a really beautiful and heartbreaking novel. I have so many questions to ask you, but before we get to that, can you give us a short passage from the book?
Sure. I was just thinking which bit to read for you guys. And I wanted to read something I haven't read already. And as you are in Kenya, why not something from the passages set in Kenya?
Excellent. Very fitting.
So this is in 1941, when the Second World War was still ongoing, and the British had fled Somaliland as the Italians were approaching, and then they returned, and Mahmood and his family had a shop. They were shopkeepers in Hargeisa. When the British returned with reinforcements, 6 months after they had evacuated the colony, they pushed the Italians back into their own empire and returned to the familiar toing and froing with the Somali clans. With South African, Indian, and East African troops to supply, the British Army became the spendthrift customer the family shop had always wanted. They had earned enough by the end of 41 to purchase a second-hand 3-ton Bedford lorry to add to their small fleet. And their mother started dropping hints that maybe it would add a little prestige to the family name to send Mahmood away to boarding school. Protesting that they would turn him Christian, make him eat pork, and teach him to look down on his illiterate brothers, Mahmood resisted hard. They could send him away, but not to Amud or any of those other prison schools. Let him go to Kenya or Tanganyika, where he could buy stock to send to Hargeisa. He'd only heard of Kenya and Tanganyika from the sailors, but they had sold him on slow-blinking, dark-lipped Swahili girls, extravagantly tall and deeply upholstered beds, and ancient cosmopolitan ports. To add to his amazement, his eldest brother agreed. Whether it was to separate him from the delinquent sailors or to toughen him up, he didn't pry. But the 13-year-old was to try his own luck as a man. Mahmood would go to Garissa in the Somali-inhabited north of Kenya to stay with the clansmen, and then the brothers would send a lorry to collect pre-arranged orders for the shop. Mahmood had absconded from Garissa within the month, contemptuous of its squat, dusty buildings and tedious familiarity. He dictated a telegram home from the central post office in stentorious Nairobi, and then pushed on to the promised amusements of Mombasa. He labored as a porter, unloading dockside dhows and passenger launches, and then found employment with a scholarly Somali merchant based in Zanzibar. He worked behind the counter of the merchant's jewelry and fabric shop in Stone Town and pined after the girls who came into the dim Coralstone Bazaar. Omani girls lost within black boobies. I never know how to say that word, but the black robes. Long plaited Banyali and Sikh brides. Grape-skinned Waswahili flirts with pierced septums. He caressed fingers as he squeezed rings past stubborn joints and shook with nervy excitement as he tied heavy necklaces around their sweat-creased necks. The world felt far away from the serpentine alleys of Stone Town, and he passed a whole year without telling his family where he was. It comforted him to know that he was beyond their orbit. He had nightmares in which his mother, with her albatross love and supernatural acquaintance, came hobbling after him, tracking the high arch of his footsteps and turning up at the bazaar, her sad, black-rimmed eyes more painful than he could say. As if running away from these dreams, he fled one day to the mainland, to Dar es Salaam. With luck pouring over him like gold, he quickly found a position with another Somali, Bibi Sahra, a Barwani widow from Mogadishu. He had told her that his brothers owned 4 lorries, and for her, that was enough reason to hand over the keys to her white Morris Minor. With a quick prayer, Mahmood got behind the broad, thin wheel of the car and realized he was too short to see far beyond the bonnet. The widow passed him her valise to sit on, but when he started the engine, its rough cough startled him and he yanked out the key, afraid he had broken something. With her shouting encouragement from the back seat and pointing at the switches and gears she had seen her previous chauffeur make use of, They made slow but sure progress to her white, jasmine-entwined bungalow. From the widow, Bibi Sahra, he learnt the art of indolence. Her days passed in a molten routine of beautification, dining, and promenading.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful reading. It's a nice shout out to East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Nadifa Mohamed, I read somewhere that you've been working on this book in some way or another for about 17 years. Can you tell
That's
us
right.
how Mahmood Mattan's extraordinary story came into your life and kind of sort of took over your imagination?
It came through a right-wing tabloid in the UK called the Daily Mail, who, as well as perpetuating hate against immigrants, also has some quite interesting true life stories occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a double-page spread in the newspaper covering what had happened to Mahmood and the successful campaign to clear his name in the late 90s. So this was in 2004, so it must have been another update to that review of his case. So that's where I found it. And from that moment on, I knew that there was something exciting about it. There was something important about it. And I quickly found out that my father knew him. And so the connection between my creative side, which was only then really starting to come to life, this case, my father and his story, it all became intertwined and it all followed me for the next couple of decades almost.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm always curious when I hear writers say things like this, that a story has come to them, but then it's sort of, they just sort of, it kind of takes over their lives, but in the background because they have other things to do first.
Yeah.
In all the years, through life's ups and downs and other obligations,
Of course,
was there a central sort of question or curiosity about this case and this story that compelled you to keep at it?
Always. So I wrote 2 books in the meantime. I had lots of family things to attend to. But even then, I would still just check in. I'd Google, see what was new. And sadly, over that period of time, one son, but first of all, I think Laura died, and then each of the sons died. Or maybe I think one of the sons died before Laura, and then the other 2 after her. So they would be in the news. And it was one of those cases that haunts people. I think that's why, there were 4 other men, Black and Asian men, executed in 1952, but it's very hard to get any information on them, as well as the 20 other British men who were also executed. People tend to just disappear from public imagination, but for some reason, Mahmood Mattan never did. So there was always something to keep you coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those people who are not familiar with this story, Mahmood Mattan's very tragic story, can you give us a sense of who he was, a kind of character sketch?
Sure. So that was my imagined Mahmood, who was born in Hargeisa around the same time as my father, 1920s, mid-20s, but to a wealthier family. His dad was a trader and a shopkeeper and had lorries, and Mahmood described his mum as being 60 when he was born, but I don't think that was the case. And he left Somalia in his teens, Somaliland, and traveled slowly down to South Africa. And there's one record of him being arrested in Northern Rhodesia for not having paperwork. So he was arrested in the 40s, and then he joined the Merchant Navy from Durban in South Africa, traveled around quite a bit, then washed up in Britain in 1947, the same year as my father. And Mahmood was quite a different character to my father. So my father quickly went to sea as an almost permanent lifestyle. He was barely ever on land. But Mahmood, I think, tired of the sea and the fact that he'd married this young woman, Laura, 17-year-old, in Cardiff in 47, after a 3-month relationship, kept him tied to this country in a way that my father and his peers generally tried to avoid. So when everything happened in 1952, he was separated from Laura. They had 3 sons, and his life had kind of frayed. Another Somali sailor who'd known him, who had been with him on the wedding day, had said, he'd kind of thinned out, he'd lost it a bit. Yeah. And he was someone that people found difficult. He was living beyond the Somali community. They would generally live all together in boarding houses set up by the shipping companies, but he'd decided to leave or he'd been kicked out after stealing from the mosque. He stole money from the mosque. So he was living with a group of West Indian and West African men very close to Laura's house, opposite from her, and doing some petty crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things I found really fascinating, and I think works really well as a work of fiction, is that, yes, we know that Mahmood is not guilty of this crime that he eventually gets hung for, but at the same time, you don't, you sort of don't sort of
Sugarcoat
his character, and that he
No.
is a flawed human being who has a lot of issues and a lot of demons, so that you're constantly rooting for him and also frustrated by him, and I found that really quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the more I found out about him, the more interesting he became. There's an impulse when someone is a victim of a huge miscarriage of justice like this to make them too innocent, too tragic, quite clean-cut character. And that takes away from them. And it also creates an idea that if someone is unlikable, that they're more deserving of injustice, which is not the case. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you annoy, who you disrespect. Justice should be fair and impartial. So I wanted him to be who he was as freely as possible. And he's got good qualities. He's a good father. Laura said that he'd never hit her, which in that period of time was endemic. All husbands beat their wives. Why not? And if he went to court over it, often the judge would say, well, he was within his rights to do that. So there was a gentleness to him and a sensitivity. And there was something that happened to him, because up until Laura left him, he didn't break the law. He was just an ordinary working man. And it was after she separated from him that his life started to kind of go astray.
Yeah, there's a kind of unraveling.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've never written historical fiction.
Why not?
I don't even know what sort of imagine. I can't even imagine what kind of work is involved. But I'm interested in, and I've always been interested in, the relationship between the truth, with a capital T, and sort of what is the public record, and how much like a novelist has to invent and imagine as a fiction writer. I'm thinking specifically of those scenes when he's awaiting trial and he's in the jail, and there's a lot that happens there. Some really horrific things, some beautiful moments, and especially the one that I'm thinking of is there's a visceral scene where he has an emotional breakdown and he's put in a straitjacket. And it's so reminiscent of all of these cell phone footages that we've been sort of become accustomed to, of Black men who are being beaten and abused in the hands of law enforcement officials.
Of course, yeah.
Did that happen? Was that part of the sort of public record?
That was one of the most shocking things, because it was another researcher, Chris Phillips, who's also written a book about Mahmood Mattan, which is a non-fiction account. Chris is someone who's researched Jack the Ripper. He's got a much deeper history of true crime than me, but he was also interested in the case, and he couldn't really explain why he was either. We were both just deeply attached to it. So he gave me the medical records from Cardiff prison that he'd accessed somehow. And they were the worst thing. They were the most shocking documents that I read, because he had the intimacy with the doctors that he didn't have with the prison guards. So that's where I found out a lot about his life, about his family and things. These conversations, these evaluations that the doctors were doing with him on the sly, and intelligence tests and all sorts, measuring him, weighing him in every possible way. But that moment where, I think it must be in the medical records, where they talk about how he was put in a padded cell it's a belt, so slightly different from the straitjackets you imagine. So it's like a big leather belt with these straps to the side, very medieval looking. And he was a slight man. He wasn't a strong man, really. He was strong in that kind of sinewy, tough way, but he wasn't a big man. So the idea of all of these ex-army prison warders piling on top of him and then chaining him up like this, and throwing him into a padded cell to come back to his senses, when he's responding in a way that most of us would respond to after almost 6 months of containment, or at that point maybe it was 4 months. And he became the madman. He became the chained Black man who they could now say, oh, he's lost his mind, so we don't have to listen to anything he says. So it was really upsetting to read those passages.
Yeah, but I was and it's a great. I'm happy to hear that that was part of the stuff that you found out in your research. But I'm sure there must have been also moments where, you know, your job as a novelist is to sort of fill in the lived experience of your protagonist, which is missing from official records. Can you give us an example of those sort of fill in the details kind of moments?
Everything, the whole novel. So what I read out, you know, that's me imagining what his imperatives were, his motivations were, his journey, his physical journey. How would he have survived as a teenager in all of these cities and towns where he didn't know anyone? And I can use small things as references. I can use some research, but there's no way of really copying and pasting that. It's down to my imagination. Also, his daily life. So I knew he liked playing poker. He liked the horses, greyhound tracks, and he would talk about getting his dole money. That was a big part of his income, was his dole money. So I was interested in what the dole. I was on the dole after university, unsure what I wanted to do. But what was it like to be on the dole in the 40s and 50s? What was the vibe? And you know, the welfare state was very new at that time. It was revolutionary. So Mahmood was able to, I think in the 30s, before the welfare state was established, and there was the depression and a massive lack of work and therefore an increase in discrimination. Some Somali sailors died of starvation. So that was a possibility just a couple of decades earlier. But thankfully, when Mahmood and my father had arrived, that wasn't likely anymore. And I wanted to compare his experience of being on the dole to mine.
Yeah. I'm going to be jumping around because I want to squeeze in as much questions as possible. In all your three novels, they are steeped in history. They are, in a sense, I kind of think of them as a conversation with an interrogation of history. What is it about history that fascinates you so much? Is there an element of wanting to correct or at least complicate the official narrative that history often purports to be?
Partly, I think it must be partly that. But also, the line between fiction and history is much blurrier than it seems. I think people assume that history is real facts and fiction is just completely made up fantasy. And that's not the case. You'd find lots of reality in people's novels, whether that's their own family stories or things that they had borne witness to. And while history is often, as we know, very selective, biased, sometimes outright lies, you know, the British understanding of their own history is so silly and so poor most of the time that that's not fact. You know, we're talking about myths. We're talking about national myths, historical myths. So the blurred line is where I think I find most interest. And also, when I studied history at university, what intrigued me were those individual stories lost in time. And I think I've spoken about them before, but you know, just if you're looking at the Reformation in England in the 1500s, 1600s, the way that, you know, one woman, an elderly woman who couldn't read or write, would save and save and save until she could purchase a Bible in English, so that someone could read it to her, so she could understand the word of God more directly in her understanding, and then that she would be executed for that. That to me is much more interesting to me than what Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, you know, what laws they were passing and the pressures on them to do this or that. That individual's death and life and desire and small, you know, that human aspect of history is what really keeps me coming back to historical novels.
Again, it's that idea of the lived experience of everyday people that's missing from most of the history that we gain.
Yeah, and you know, we think that these big high level decisions are the important ones, but no, I think that our world is a amalgamation, conglomeration of all of these individual desires and spirits and hatreds and everything combined, and that's probably a closer way of understanding why we are where we are right now.
Yeah, and it's oftentimes I find those sort of the coming together of all those individual aspirations and dreams and hopes that sometimes produce these huge life-changing historical events, whether they're the Arab Spring or the Reformation or the French Revolution or whatever it may be.
Yeah,
It's small sort of narratives that sort of coalesce to produce those.
Yeah, and what brought all of those people out in the Arab Spring? They could have, if it was just the injustice, well, they'd been experiencing that injustice for years. So what happened? What was the spark that just flared in everyone to make them act as one body? And that's true of all sorts of historical moments. It's true of the civil war in Somalia. They've put up with a lot of crap for years already. So why then? What was the last straw? Or what did someone? It's really difficult to unpick, and that's what history is there for, to kind of go through the archives, to record and to compare narratives. But maybe they are questions actually better left for fiction, because you have to step into people's minds, and people's minds are much less represented in the archive. Their behavior is represented, their crimes are represented, all sorts of things, maybe their living conditions just about, but not what was going on in their heads.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm curious about the role of the outside world on the writing process, how the events of our time impact themes that you're exploring at any given sort of time and what book you're working on. I'm sure while you were still working on this book, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Black Lives Matter movement started.
Yeah, I was editing.
Yeah. And it seems like, at the time, every week there was a news story, a new cell phone footage of a Black man, Black people, but specifically Black men, it seemed, whose lives were being destroyed in the hands of police.
In public, not even in secret.
Not just in the US, but there have also been some cases in England.
For sure.
How much of what's in the ether seeps into the work when you're writing a novel like this?
Well, the one thing that was quite welcome about what was going on last year was it felt as if the world was coming towards me. And a friend of mine, an English friend of mine, had teased me in the past because he thought that I had an extreme impression of what happened in the world with the police and with racism and things like that. And I would often tell him many of the cases I was reading about, generally in the US, where the police just did something that, they go into someone's house and shoot them dead. And he's like, that can't happen, ha ha ha. But he began to believe and understand it does happen. So it was a relief to not be, I guess the term is gaslit. And he wasn't intentionally trying to gaslight me, but his understanding of the rules and how the world is informed by his own experience. And he wasn't looking for the information that I found myself constantly coming up against, whether I was looking for it or not. So he gets it now. And I think that relationship or that dynamic has been repeated again and again and again. So some of these conversations are easier to have because I'm not having to start from scratch with people. For me, I think because I'm already immersed in quite disturbing things. I probably hit a saturation level last year where you just go online and instead of seeing silly tweets or memes, you'd see more and more carnage, whether it was the police brutalizing people during the protests and really looking to harm, all of the rockets or plastic bullets in people's eyes and things like that. It was traumatic. And it made me realize or think about the fact that the way that Mahmood died in 1952, thank God, in the UK, we don't have the death penalty, but it's easily replicated. It's replicated all the time, in the US particularly, but also in Africa, the way that the police behave, my personal experience of police brutality has been at its worst in Hargeisa. So there's an issue, a global issue that needs attention.
Absolutely. And I think your book being published, during this time when people are so much more aware of police brutality toward especially people of color, I think they're a lot more receptive to, receiving this book in the spirit in which it's written, I think.
Yes, and there are some lovely things that have come out of this new awareness, which is, Natasha, who's Mahmood Mattan's granddaughter, who grew up not really knowing her father and therefore knowing even less about her grandfather, Mahmood. She's learning more, and she led a vigil outside Cardiff prison last year to mark the 68th anniversaries of his execution. And I think it was partly organized by Black Lives Matter in Cardiff. So there's this wonderful joining up of stories and of generations and of past traumas with current traumas. Early this year, a young Somali guy died after a night in Cardiff Cardiff Bay police station. So it just feels really current and really disturbingly repetitive, and as if we're stuck in a position that we're struggling to get out of.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think your book does so beautifully is that it shows what it feels like for Mahmood to be the man that he is and knows himself to be, and what the world outside, in this case, white Cardiff circa 1940s, thinks of him. And there's kind of a double consciousness of identity play. And
Yeah.
it really made me think about what it must be like for people like you and me, who are African, but who grew up in the diaspora, and not just us, but like, many more, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people like us.
Yeah.
And the way that we think of ourselves versus sort of the way the outside world's, and the outside world's sort of different conception of who we are based on our race. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on that notion of, sort of the double consciousness about our identity, not just in the case of Mahmoud, but also in your own case, a Somali British woman who is, living in London.
Yeah, sure. So with Mahmoud, his identity was a complicated thing where he was more willing to go beyond his traditional identity than other Somali sailors. That's why he married a Welsh woman. That's why he was living outside of the Somali community. He was pushing the boundaries of what he could be. And I guess, yeah, I think I do the same. I don't want to be hemmed in. I was thinking about this the other day because a woman came up to me in the street and just asked me a really personal question. She wasn't Somali actually, but African, and she was trying to judge me on a framework that she valued, but hadn't been her own framework, because I know a little bit about her own life story. And her question was just, it was almost as if, I need to put you in a box. Tell me quickly so I can put you in a box. What this part of your life is like. And partly maybe because I was the youngest and I came here when I was so young, I've never really felt I fit into any box neatly. I always spill out in some way. So for the Somalis, I'm often too English, too this, too that. For English people, I'm too Muslim, too this, too that. And I think that's a position that lots of writers find themselves in. And it's a fruitful, fertile place to be. Because if you feel too closely something, I think you probably don't have the distance to be able to look from the outside in and examine it properly. So I don't think I suffer from double consciousness, because I don't think I accepted either consciousness well or deeply enough. So something that I keep being struck by in novels that are coming out, there's more and more novels by young Black women of different backgrounds, is there is a double consciousness and a desire to be as close to whiteness as possible, and a real terror or sadness when that proves too difficult. And I don't think that was my experience of growing up.
Yeah, me neither, actually. And I didn't know we had this in common. I'm also the youngest in my family who traveled abroad, and I also had the similar sort of feeling of whether it was conscious or not wanting to sort of ally myself too closely to any particular identity.
Yeah.
Whether it was given to me by my Somali community or the Canadian community, there was always this feeling of discomfort in being embraced by one particular identity fully.
And I'm very alienated when people want you to jump through hoops, and all communities want you to jump through hoops for acceptance. Yeah. And that to me is just no. The answer is no. Yeah. And if that means I don't have full membership of a community, that's fine. That's a fair trade.
But I think it does help the writing thing, don't you think? Being a novelist often requires a kind of distance from whatever it is that you're writing about. So
yeah, because there is a betrayal in writing. The minute you start writing, you are kind of betraying a secrecy that's part of being part of a community.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a line in the book that, okay, I'm going to confess that it brought tears to my eyes. And it's to the end of the book, and it reads, this body that has been weighed, and it's Mattan sort of thinking about his body and taking stock of his body.
Yeah.
And it reads, this body that has been weighed, measured, poked, beaten, despised, and now it's scheduled for destruction. And I think what it does, that passage, and that whole scene, in fact, of him, you know, being in the bathtub, looking at his body, is that it brilliantly takes the reader into Mahmood's consciousness, and what he must be thinking, what he must be feeling in the last hours of his life. And for some reason, it reminded me again of George Floyd and all the other Black men whose bodies were the object of fear and hate and
destruction.
Talk about that, absolutely. And I was wondering if you could talk about that scene in the bathtub.
It's a painful thing to talk about. For me, it's upsetting as well, because, you know, our body is our machine. It's our casing. Casing is not a very nice word, but it's the thing that allows us to have a physical presence in the world. Whether we
how about the seed of our souls, our Black souls?
It is, yeah. It's our sausage casing. And for it to feel pain, for whatever reason, whether that's abuse when you're a child from someone, or from the police as an adult, or in whatever instance, or women having to be afraid of the incitement that their bodies create, you know, that's something that you're constantly made to feel aware of in Somaliland. You know, your neck showing. Why is your neck showing? Why is your ankle showing? Why are your wrists showing? Because your body is not your own. That's the feeling I get, is that they're trying to drag your body away from your own ownership of it. And that's terrifying. Once you do that to people, you pull their mind apart. You really start to mess with the thing that they need to be whole and to be happy. And Mahmood's body, he was a piece of machinery. That's how the British state saw him. The reason he was allowed in the country is because he was part of the cheap apparatus in the engine room. So he was cheaper than a British body would have been. And then the way that the prison system dehumanizes people of all types, of all descriptions, but particularly more recently Black men in the UK, at least, where they've become a bigger and bigger part, a larger and larger part of the prison system, as have Muslim men of different backgrounds. Your body becomes a unit that they're shuffling around from prison to prison, cell to cell. They gain access to you, and that desire to touch and to penetrate. There was a sexual element, and I think there is generally a sexual element to all of this racist violence, where the only way that men can touch other men, especially across racial lines or other lines, is through violence. But what it really is a manifestation of some sort of obsession or interest or desire sometimes. So Mahmood, when they all pin him down,
and desire sort of coming together in some weird concoction.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, often women are given as the excuse, oh, we're protecting our women, or, you know, that we're jealous of these men who've taken our women. It's not really about women. It's a dynamic between men.
Yeah, I agree. So we have only a couple of more minutes left, and I wanted to give some of the people who have tuned in a chance to ask you a question. So Asad Hussein asked, he said, let's see, what are some of the challenges that the archive has presented, assuming that much has been written about Mahmood Mattan? And the second question is, how did you choose to form it? What are the freedoms that the novel provides? So if you can take those two questions in.
Okay, the challenges that the archives provide, the chief challenge is the fact that it's the archive that the police put together and the legal system put together. So it's a fiction of its own. It's very incomplete. It's the Criminal Case Review Commission in the late 90s revealed all of the lies embedded in it. So you're reading a piece of fiction while trying to write another piece of fiction and hoping in some way. What it did offer me was verbatim documents saying this is what Mahmood said in reply to this. He was consistently saying that he didn't do it, he had nothing to do with it. He never broke on that. He was never persuaded to to move to their position in return for some sort of kindness. It also allowed me, what I actually like and love about archives is the dispassionateness of them. They're not, everything else is designed to entertain, and they don't entertain. And you're left to imagine everything yourself, to immerse yourself in that room, in that police station cell, where 1 minute the police officer is offering Mahmood some tea and sandwiches, and the next minute he's telling him, you killed that woman. And this didn't appear in the archives, but Mahmood told Laura that they had said, it doesn't matter if you did it or not, you're going to hang for this. So it didn't appear in the police archives, but it's now thankfully in the archives of the Criminal Case Review Commission. So sometimes you have competing archives that can challenge each other. The second part of the question was, why novel? Novels are they are the way that I find, the way I find it easiest to express myself. I was always a huge reader growing up, and so I imagine it very visually in my mind, but I love the independence and solitariness of just sitting down with a computer like this and putting what's in your imagination on paper. And it allowed me to play with that line between fiction and fact. And I've always thought about what I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to create an edifice with all of the information I have. What I feel I'm trying to do is excavate something that was already there, that was under the ground, and you take it, you brush away what you can brush away, and you're left with this imperfect structure, the walls maybe, or some broken pottery inside the ruins. But from that, you can see what it was, and you imagine, you recover what is left to recover yourself.
Yeah, I would go even further in that. I would say, again, as a reader of fiction mostly, novels are for me a way of actually making sense of the world and sort of trying to understand my place in the world and human relationships. So to me, the novel is kind of, although far from a perfect artistic form, to me it's the most humane and the most sort of, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I find it to be that.
No, it's true. And I did with Black Mamba Boy, it started off as a biography. I wanted to stay completely close to what my father's life was like and about. But then I had to make a jump into fiction because there were gaps that I couldn't work out what to do with, what my father was thinking and feeling. And I'm sure there are some amazing biographers out there who know how to do that. But for me, I needed the framework of a novel to be able to do that.
Yeah, we have another question from one of our viewers, whose name I am going to butcher. I know, Kutsashi. I apologize for butchering your name. She said, she asks, or I'm assuming it's a she, how did you come up with the title of The Fortune Man? There are phrases, the Fortune Man. Yeah, there was a reference apparently in the Black Mamba Boy to.
Yes. Yeah, so when when Jama gets his passport in Egypt and he's showing it around and everyone's excited for him, they say, oh, now you're going to you're becoming one of the fortune men. And it was a term used amongst that generation for the Somalis who had gone abroad to join the Merchant Navy. And this was the 4th or 5th or 6th title. We've been through lots of titles, but it's the strongest one. And I'm really glad we went for it. It was I kind of found it at the last minute, but it makes perfect sense. Yeah. And Mahmood is a man of fortune. He just kept playing that roulette wheel for his life.
Absolutely. But it's also a kind of a tragic irony as well, that the place that he had gone to seek fortune ends up actually, doing what
destroyed him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of more questions, but as the host of the event, I reserve the right to ask the last question.
Oh, I can see one question that I can answer super quickly.
Yes, please, yes.
2 questions that are connected. Have you received any backlash for awakening this story? No, thank God. And how can people in sub-Saharan Africa get your book? This is a complicated one. It should be available in Kenya, in Prestige Books, and another bookshop as well as Amazon. You can get it on Kindle. And I want to get copies to Somalia and Somaliland. And it should be distributed by my UK publishers in South Africa. So those are the places I know you can get it. But beyond that, we'll work it out.
Yeah. It's one of the most frustrating aspects of being a novelist is trying to bring the book to as many places as possible. Yeah.
Ideally, you'd have a publisher in Africa that could then distribute from there. So we'll
Ideal.
see what can happen.
Absolutely. We have only, I want to let you go because I know you have a place to go. I'm fascinated by what happened to Mahmood's wife and children and what became of them. And I read somewhere that one of his sons, his body was found alone. I don't know if it was presumably by suicide. We don't know what happened exactly.
It wasn't clear.
Yeah, and it really broke my heart to see that the trauma of what had been done to his father, it continues, generationally. And I was wondering if you could talk about what you found out about the family.
Yes, and this isn't unique to their family. The more I've learned about people who were executed and their families, this is a recurring theme, that the trauma is so great and the shame, especially this all of the executions in Britain happened pre-1965. So you're dealing with a different culture, and the culture of that time was so ridden of shame, and of course there was no counseling, no openness. Even the family would never talk about that person again. And in Mahmood's case, the murder victim's family, they also didn't talk about the murder victim. It was just this wall that would come down. So all of that trauma was just left to sit, and it manifested in the way that Laura raised her children, her sons, the way that their adult lives panned out. They struggled with alcoholism and homelessness, and even the fact that his name was cleared and that there was some compensation. It was too late. The harm had been done, and the generation after them has also suffered harm.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to, if maybe very early on Laura and the small boys and the murder victim's family had received therapy and support and an open space to talk about what had happened, maybe some of this intergenerational harm could have been prevented, but it became embedded.
Absolutely. Well, we've come to the end of our chat, Nadifa, and I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on this wonderful and deeply moving work. And
thank you, Hassan. Thank you for having me today.
And special thanks to the Columbia Global Center. And I now will pass you to Lillian, who will give us a last word.
Wow. Thank you, Hassan, Dedi, and thank you, Nadifa Mohamed. Such an inspiring conversation, very informative. We really appreciate your commitment and partnership and collaboration with us. And on behalf of CGC Nairobi, I would like to express our appreciation to all our valuable to all our audiences. My deepest gratitude goes to those whom have sincerely given us this support and participation. We hope to see you in our next session of the series, as well as other webinars in the pipeline. And to get the latest update, please remember to follow us on Facebook and Twitter at CGC Nairobi and Instagram, cgc.nairobi. I've already posted them on the chat. And with that, I would like to say a big thank you, and have yourself a splendid.
Thank you. I'll come to Nairobi as soon as I can.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.